This lecture will be covering continued discussion on learning of Chapter 6. Okay, so we're picking up where we left off on Friday. I'm probably going to do some repeating of what I might have said on Friday, but it's important that this information is good and clear for you. It's like I mentioned on Friday, learning can be confusing if you don't take time to get the terminology and the theory down within your mind. So let me go back and talk again about Pavlov and classical conditioning. Remember now, Ivan Pavlov, he was a Russian physiologist, who was the one who discovered classical conditioning. And remember now, this is the process by which an association will form between a neutral stimulus, which will become a conditioned stimulus, and one that will initially would evoke a reflexive type response. And remember, the response is considered the unconditioned stimulus. What happens is it'll result in a new type of response, and that's what we call the conditioned response. This conditioned response will be to that conditioned stimulus. So Pavlov basically, he believed that the conditioned response would be the same as the unconditioned response, except it's quantitatively, meaning that it's something observable that we can actually measure. So for that conditioned salivation that we were seeing in a dog, that's correct. However, there are many other type of cases that may show a different story. So suppose you would expose a rat to a tone, which, remember, the tone would be the conditioned stimulus, and it's followed by a foot shock. Jump, wow. Anyway, the foot shock is going to be considered that unconditioned stimulus, and it's been paired with it repeatedly, okay? So that unconditioned response would be jumping, shrieking. You might jump and yell. I don't know about you, but for me, I would probably holler. But the conditioned response to that tone alone is probably going to be freezing in place, like a small animal typically would do at the sign of any kind of danger. So that is to say, the rat does not treat the conditioned stimulus as being the same as the unconditioned stimulus in this case. So just remember, make sure you kind of get these terms down within your mind, and know the definition of classical conditioning for examination purposes. And like I said, although it's not mentioned here on the slide, do know that a neutral stimulus would equate to what the conditioned stimulus is. And again, that's going to be a response that would depend on any kind of preceding conditions that occur, whatever you're associating with the unconditioned stimulus. All right, so let's go ahead and move forward. So back in the 1900s, when Pavlov first stumbled upon this observation, he kind of offered a simple explanation for learning. Pretty much, he noticed that that dog would secrete digestive juices as soon as he saw a lab worker who customarily fed the dogs. And because this secretion clearly depended on the dog's previous experiences, Pavlov called it a psychological secretion. He kind of enlisted the help of other specialists who would help to discover the T's in a dog with the sight of food helped to produce that salivation. And it was that as predictable and automatic as any kind of reflex. So Pavlov again called this a conditioned reflex because it depended on those type of conditions. Pavlov also assumed that animals are born with automatic connections, and he called those the unconditioned reflexes. And that would be between a stimulus such as that food and a response such as the secreting digestive juices. Pretty much what he did was he conjectured that animals will acquire new reflexes by transferring a response from one stimulus to another. So another example might be if there's a particular sound that always would precede the food, an animal would salivate to the sound as if it was the food itself. Pavlov, he kind of attached that tube to one of the salivary ducts in the dog's mouth to help to measure the salivation. And that's kind of shown in the slide that you're looking at. So whenever Pavlov gave a dog food, the dog salivated. The food, then the salivation connection would be automatic, and that required no training whatsoever. Pavlov called the food the unconditioned stimulus, okay? And he called salivation the unconditioned response. So the unconditioned stimulus would be an event that automatically will elicit any kind of unconditioned response. And the unconditioned response is the action that the unconditioned stimulus will elicit. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to be making repetitive statements. As we are doing learning, I want you to make sure that this information is going to get locked based on classical conditioning. Anyway, moving on, I'm going to keep saying as Pavlov, he then introduced a new stimulus, like that metronome or the tone that I was talking about. And then upon hearing that metronome, the dog lifted its ears, it looked around, but it didn't salivate actually. So the metronome was a neutral stimulus in regards to the salivation. Excuse me, Pavlov would then sound the metronome shortly before giving the dog food to the dog. After pairing it with the metronome and the food together, eventually the dogs began to salivate as soon as it heard the metronome. Okay, so now that metronome is considered to be a conditioned stimulus because the dog's response to it depends on the preceding conditions, that being it's the pairing of the conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. So the salivation again will follow the metronome within that conditioned response. And the conditioned response is going to be whatever response the conditioned stimulus elicits as a result of the conditioning or training procedure. So at the start of that conditioned stimulus, it'll elicit no significant response. But after the conditioning occurs, then conditioned response will happen. And just to take a look at, we talked about it on Friday, but just as a reminder, go through this slide once again in looking at other forms of classical conditioning. We talked about the alarm clock, okay? Think about a dentist. We talked about the pizza box. So these are all different kind of everyday situations that you can see where classical conditioning occurs. What I like for you to do is just take time to think of more forms of classical conditionings that you've noticed within everyday life. Now, after that discovery of classical conditioning, Pavlov, along with others researchers, they kind of varied the procedures to help produce different outcomes. And that conditioned response, as mentioned on Friday, it can be extinguished by repeatedly presenting that conditioned stimulus by itself. So take the metronome again. All right, we know that we paired it with food, and the dog was able to begin to salivate to the metronome because it's been paired with the food. However, if we took the food away and we continuously just paired the metronome, no pairing at all actually, just kept showing it to the dog or allowing the dog to hear it, eventually the dog's not going to salivate anymore. There's no food there to help keep to strengthen that conditioned response. So extinction again would be that process that will weaken a conditioned response by continuously presenting that conditioned stimulus without the conditioned stimulus, if that makes sense. And actually it should say unconditioned stimulus. Okay. If the conditioned stimulus is not going to be presented at all for some time after the extinction, then presented again, that conditioned response may return. And again, like I mentioned on Friday, this is what we call spontaneous recovery. Okay, it's the temporary return of an extinguished response after a delay of time or after some period of time. All of a sudden, that tone is played again, and guess what? The dog starts to salivate. A conditioned response to a stimulus will extend to other stimuli to the extent that it might resemble the trained stimulus. So an example you could think of is bee stings. Suppose a bee stings you and you learn to fear the bees. So now you see a wasp or a hornet. Guess what? Well, you fear that too. You probably will, but you probably is not going to fear the butterflies, or you're not going to be afraid of other insects that doesn't resemble bees. But if the bee and the wasp, you know, they all look alike, you know, they got stingers, then you tend to have that same type of fear. This is what we talk about in terms of stimulus generalization. And that's because it's an extension of that conditioned response from the training of the stimulus to a similar type of stimuli. The bee and the wasps, they may be different insects, but they kind of look alike. So therefore, what you was conditioned to after being stung by the bee, you're going to automatically assume that that wasp will give you the same type, and you'll feel that you're in danger. So talking in terms of animals, as well as people, we learn to respond differently to that stimuli and predict different outcomes. You might be able to discriminate between a bell that signals time for class to starting and a different bell that would signal fire alarm. All these are different types of ways for us to discriminate, being able to know and be able to predict different outcomes based upon our experiences and knowing the difference between a school bell and a fire alarm. There might be some slight difference, but knowing when it's ringing and how it's ringing kind of allows us to be able to discriminate what that would be, which would allow us to react differently. All right. So now, if we took classical conditioning and talked about drug tolerance, drug tolerance results partly because of the automatic chemical changes that will happen in the cells throughout our bodies, but it's going to also depend partly on that classical conditioning, just as I mentioned on Friday. So think about this. When drug users will inject themselves with morphine or heroin, the drug injection procedure, which can be a complex stimulus because it includes time and place as well as the needle injection. So the total stimulus predicts a second stimulus, and that's going to be the drug's entry into our brains. When that drug reaches the brain, it triggers a variety of different body defenses, and that'll include changes in our hormone secretions, our heart rate, as well as our breathing rate. This is going to counteract the effects of the drug itself. So whenever one stimulus helps to predict a second stimulus, it's going to help to produce an automatic response. That's when classical conditioning can occur. So an example would be if we took the first stimulus, which is the injection procedure, and that injection procedure would be considered the conditioned stimulus. The second stimulus is going to be once the drug enters our brain. That's the unconditioned stimulus. The response, the body defenses against those drugs, is our unconditioned response. Drug tolerance, again, will weaken the effects of a drug after someone has taken that drug repeatedly. Okay? The more they do it, the less effect it's going to have. Drug tolerance will result, again, in part because of that classical conditioning. Your body is going to put up defenses to kind of help to reject it. The drug administration procedure will then evoke those defensive responses. Now let's go back to Pavlov, talking about him. He kind of stated that conditioning depends really on the timing between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. He surmised that presenting the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus at nearly the same time will cause a connection to grow in our brain so that the animal, or in the brain, so that the animal treated the conditioned stimulus as if it was the unconditioned stimulus. Later on, there's been studies that help to contradict that idea. First, let's talk about how a shock that was done to rats, which the shock would be unconditioned stimulus. It causes the rats to jump and to shriek. But then there's the conditioned stimulus that's paired with shock that'll make them freeze in the position. They'll react again to that conditioned stimulus as a danger signal. Not as if they felt a shock, but that the conditioning did not simply transfer the response from one stimulus to another. Also keep in mind that in trace conditioning, where there's a delay, it separates the end of the conditioned stimulus from the start of the unconditioned stimulus. The animal in this case does not make a conditioned response immediately after the conditioned stimulus, but instead kind of waits until almost the end of the usual delay that will be found between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. Again, it's not treating the conditioned stimulus as if it were the unconditioned stimulus. Instead, it is using it as a predictor. It's a way to prepare for that unconditioned stimulus. It is true, as Pavlov suggested, that the longer the delay between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, the weaker the condition is going to be. Other things being equal, okay? However, just having that conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus close together in time, it's not really going to be enough. It's important that they kind of occur more often together rather than occurring apart. That being said, the conditioned stimulus must be a good predictor of the unconditioned stimulus. So now let's move away from classical conditioning and let's talk a little bit about operant conditioning. Going through this part of the chapter, we're going to talk about the procedures of operant conditioning and look at the differences between the operant conditioning as well as classical conditioning. We're going to start talking about definitions in terms of reinforcement and look at how reinforcement and punishment differs from one another. Then we'll also talk about the procedures of extinction in operant conditioning and see the differences between those in classical conditioning. We'll also learn about shaping, chaining, and scheduled reinforcement and how it can change up the behavior of an individual and how it influences. And then we'll talk about how operant conditioning goes in everyday living. All right, so this is this slide is helping us to introduce Edward Thorndike, and pretty much what he was a graduate student at Harvard who sought to be a simple behaviorist explanation in learning. What he did was he put cats into puzzle boxes from which they could escape by pressing a lever, pulling a string, and then tilting a pole or other means. Now, cats learned to make whatever response that opened the box, particularly if the box opened quickly. They learned this through trial and error. So when the cat had to tilt a pole to escape from the box, it might use its first paw, or he gnawed at the door, would scratch the walls, would pace back and forth. Eventually, it bumped up against the pole, and guess what? The door opened. The next time, the cat would go through a similar repertoire of behaviors, but he might bump against the pole a little sooner. Over many trials, the cat gradually but inconsistently improved its speed of escape. In this situation, Thorndike he kind of concluded that learning occurs because certain behaviors are strengthened at the expense of others. Thus, an animal would enter a situation with the repertoire of responses like the pouring of the door, scratching the walls, pacing, and so forth. And on this slide, you can see that they labeled it with R1, R2, R3, and so on. And pretty much what happens is it starts this most probable response, and that probable response is R1. If nothing special happened, then it proceeds to the other responses, eventually reaching one that would open the door. So an example, that bumping against the pole, which would be in this example on the slide R7. Opening that door helped to reinforce the preceding behavior. So a reinforcement is the process of increasing the future probability of the most recent response. Thorndike said that reinforcement helps to stamp in or kind of strengthen the response in itself. The next time the cat is in the puzzle box, it has a slightly higher probability of the effective response. If it receives reinforcement again, then that probability is going to go up another notch. This view fits with behaviorist hope for an explanation that it didn't rely on thoughts, it didn't rely on feelings or understanding or other type of mental processes. Again, actions speak louder than words in this case. Now, the kind of learning that Thorndike studied is what we call operant conditioning, because that subject operates on the environment that's going to help to produce an outcome. Or you can think about instrumental conditioning, and that's because the subject's behavior is instrumental in producing that outcome. Operant or instrumental conditioning is basically that process of changing behavior by providing a reinforcer after a response. So the defining difference between operant conditioning and classical conditioning is within the procedure. In operant conditioning, the subject's behavior is going to produce an outcome that affects future behavior. In classical conditioning, the subject's behavior has no effect on the outcome. The presentation of either that conditioned stimulus or the unconditioned stimulus. So an example can be in classical conditioning, the experimenter, or we could say the world itself, presents two stimuli at particular times, and regardless of what the subject does or doesn't do. Those stimuli changes the future behaviors, but the behaviors do not control the stimuli. While in operant conditioning, the subject has to make some kind of response before any outcome can occur. Generally speaking, the two kinds of conditioning also is going to affect different type of behaviors. Classical conditioning applies mainly to those visceral type responses, that being responses of internal organs like the salivation or digestion, whereas operant conditioning is going to apply more mainly to skeletal responses or more voluntary types like movements or leg muscles, arm muscles, etc. Now, there are some events that work extremely well as reinforcers for some people and then not for others. And we might guess that there are reinforcers that's biologically useful for a person, but many are not. So if someone has been deprived of the opportunity to engage in a particular behavior, then the opportunity to return to that behavior is going to be reinforcing. Okay? This is what we call disequilibrium principle, and that's that idea again that's going to that anything that'll prevent an activity will actually discombobulate, so to speak, or throw us off, and pretty much it's going to help with the opportunity to help to return equilibrium, and the equilibrium is what's the reinforcer in this case. All right, so psychologists have been able to distinguish between primary reinforcers, or those unconditioned reinforcers, that are reinforcing because of their own properties. And then there's secondary reinforcers. These are those conditioned type reinforcers that became reinforcing by association with something else. Food and water would be considered primary reinforcers, whereas money is considered to be a secondary reinforcer. And it becomes reinforcing because we kind of exchange it for the food or other primary reinforcers. Like you could think of a primary reinforcer, we said food and water. It's necessary for us to have clothing, to keep safe with, a roof over our head. The secondary reinforcer being money. We need money for food, we need money for water, we need money for clothing, we need money for a roof over our head. So that's why money is considered to be a second reinforcer. Now let's talk a little bit about punishment. B.F. Skinner back in 1938 kind of tested punishment within a famous lab study. He first looked at training food-deprived rats by having them press a bar to get food, and then he stopped reinforcing their presses. So for the first 10 minutes, some rats not only failed to get the food, but they also received a slap on the paws, so to speak, every time they pressed the bar. Because the bar slapped the paws as it went back, it popped them. Anyway, the punished rats temporarily would suppress their pressing, but in the long run, what happened is they pressed as many times as they did the unpunished rats. So Skinner concluded that punishment would produce no long-term effects. However, this conclusion is kind of an overstatement. A better way of saying coming to an outcome would be that punishment does not greatly weaken a response when no other response is available. Skinner's food-deprived rats had no other way to seek food, so that's why it didn't really show any differences. So remember, punishment is an event that would help to decrease the probability of a response or the behavior. And it's going to either be a presentation of something like receiving pain or withholding of the food. And I want you to stop and think of other forms of punishment that you might have encountered in your time. Think about my class. What type of reinforcers and punishments have I utilized to help you to be a great student in the classroom? All right, so do know though that punishment is going to be best when it's done in a predictable manner and immediate. If you wait, it's not going to be that as effective. Okay, so for an example, if we talk about punishment in terms of trying to decrease a behavior with a child who has, say for example, they wrote on the walls at home, and the parent saw this and didn't do anything for an hour, do you think the child would go back later again and write on the wall? Something to think about. All right, so all right, so now we have 4 categories of operant conditioning to review. Okay, on this slide you have the upper and lower showing reinforcement. Okay, reinforcement will always increase the probability of a behavior happening. Okay, it can be either positive reinforcement, and when we talk about positive reinforcement, this is presenting something like food, or if we talk about negative reinforcement, then we're avoiding something such as pain. Okay, this is where it gets confusing for people, because a lot of times when we hear positive, people want to think good or bad. And remember, we're trying to either increase a behavior. So negative reinforcement can still increase a behavior. Okay, but it's always with something that's in saying we're trying to avoid when we're utilizing negative reinforcement in order to increase a particular behavior. That's why I said it can get really confusing. Anyway, moving forward, going back and talking about punishment again, remember that punishment will always decrease the probability of a behavior happening. Okay, so when we're looking on the slide here, the upper right and lower left items are going to show you these 2 types of punishment. Punishment can either be presenting something like pain or taking away something like food or privileges. That would be punishment. All right, so let's look at additional forms or phenomena of operant conditioning. So you remember there's the concepts of extinction, generalization, and discrimination that's found within classical conditioning. Well, the same concepts do apply to operant conditioning, except it's with different type of procedures. So when we're talking about operant conditioning, remember now this is a response. If it's extinguished, here it's no longer going to be followed by reinforcement. For an example, you might once have been in the habit of asking your roommate to join you for dinner. The last few times you asked, your roommate was like, no, I don't feel like going. So you stop asking. Well, in talking about classical conditioning, the extinction would be achieved only by presenting the conditioned stimulus without an unconditioned stimulus. But in this case, in operant conditioning, the procedure is going to be a response without reinforcement. So someone who receives reinforcement for a response in the presence of one stimulus will probably make the same response in the presence of another stimulus. The more similar a new stimulus is to the original reinforced stimulus, then the more likely it's going to have that same response. This is what we call stimulus generalization. So you might reach for a turn signal of a rented car in the same exact place you would find it in your own car. That would be a sign or an example of stimulus generalization. If reinforcement happens for responding to the one stimulus and not another, then the result for that would be what we call discrimination. And between them, yielding a response to one stimulus and not necessarily the other. One example you could take here is that you may smile and greet someone you think you know, but then you realize it's someone else. So after several times of experiencing this, you learn to stop and recognize the difference between the two people, and you might not smile, although it would be nice that you smile at everybody that you see. But moving forward, if you're talking about a stimulus, it indicates which response is going to be appropriate or inappropriate. That's what we would call a discriminative stimulus. So much of our behavior depends on discriminative stimuli. So think about it like this. You learn ordinarily to be quiet during a lecture. Ordinarily. There's some of you that just love to keep yicking while I'm trying to speak. But that's okay. In this case, but when you talk, I'll encourage you to join in a discussion. There's going to be those times, but within boundaries, y'all, within boundaries. So just do remember to kind of get a good idea about those differences between extinction, stimulus generalization, and discrimination. The differences between it in classical conditioning and in operant conditioning. Now, shaping behaviors and chaining behaviors. When we're talking about shaping, this is a technique that Skinner came up with for being able to train subjects to be able to perform acts by reinforcing them for successive approximations to the behavior that we desire. So, for an example, think about first your parents or teachers, they'll praise you for counting your fingers when you were little. Later on, you have to add and subtract to earn their congratulations. What it is a step-by-step. Your task will become more complex until you are doing advanced mathematics. Okay, so shaping is giving you that first reinforcer that's going to help propel you to the next task, which is going to help keeping you build up until eventually you're able to do geometry, you're able to do from algebra to geometry to calculus and so forth, as an example to give. That's what we would call shaping. Now, chaining, though, is a procedure that will be reinforcing behaviors with the opportunity to help engage within the next one. So an example of this would be you might learn to eat with a fork and spoon when you're little. Then you learn to put your own food on the plate before eating. You learn how to fix that plate. Eventually, it's going to get to where you learn how to be able to plan out a menu. You'll be able to learn how to go to the store. You're going to learn how to buy different ingredients. You start learning how to cook a meal. You're going to learn how to put it on that plate, and then you're going to learn to eat it. You're going to go through this chaining process. Each task gets you to a next level, okay? That's where each of those behaviors is reinforced by the opportunity to be doing the next type of behavior. All right. Excuse me, my neck is getting stiff. Sitting straight up, y'all know the back and everything. But let me keep moving forward instead of talking about my issues. Schedules of reinforcement. The simplest procedure in operant conditioning is going to be able to provide reinforcement for every correct response. This is a procedure that's known as continuous reinforcement. Let's talk real world though. Continuous reinforcement is not always that common, okay? Reinforcement for some responses and not for others is what we call intermittent reinforcement or partial reinforcement. So when we're talking about, let's see, intermittent reinforcement, you can think about paychecks. It's not going to come every day, but the expectation is hopefully at least every 2 weeks or every month, depending on your pay schedule. It's providing reinforcements for some responses and not for others. So you might get a bonus. We can think of that as a intermittent reinforcement. The continuous, we know we're going to be getting paid every 2 weeks. The intermittent is going to be, you may get a bonus if you perform well, and you may not. All right, let's keep going. So looking at the schedules of reinforcement, in addition to that continuous reinforcement, there is 4 other schedules for the delivery of that intermittent type of reinforcement. Those 4 being fixed ratio, fixed interval, variable ratio, and variable interval. Okay? When we're talking about a fixed ratio, this schedule will provide reinforcement only after a certain number that's fixed of correct responses. So like after every 6 response, for an example, you will get a reinforcement. These kind of examples would include like with factory workers who are being paid for every 10 pieces of work that they turn in, or fruit pickers who get paid by the bushel. Okay. When we're looking at variable ratio schedule, it's kind of similar to the fixed ratio schedule, except that reinforcement will occur after a variable number of correct responses. So an example of this might be reinforcement might sometimes occur after 1 or 2 responses, sometimes after 5 responses, or 10, and so forth. The variable ratio schedule occurs whenever each response has a nearly equal probability of success. So like when you're applying for a job, you might not be hired, and the more applications you submit, the better your chances, but you're not going to be able to predict how many applications you need in the first place before receiving a job offer. Another good way of thinking about it, well, that's a good example. I'm gonna leave it at that. Let's talk about fixed interval schedules. This provides reinforcement for the first response after a specific time interval. So in this case, let's think about an animal. They might get food for its first response after a 15-second interval. Then it will have to wait another 15 seconds before another response to be effective. Okay. Checking your mailbox can be an example of a fixed interval schedule. That's if your mailman does that they're supposed to do on a timely basis every day. Mine don't. But it's that where you're showing up at a specific time for class can be another example of a fixed interval schedule. Okay. Variable interval schedules is reinforcement is available after a variable amount of time. So an example of this is that reinforcement can occur for the first response after 2 minutes. Then for the first response, it's going to happen again at 7 seconds. Then after that one, it might be 3 minutes and 20 seconds, and you get the idea. But you cannot know how long before the next response is going to be reinforced. In this one, think about checking your emails as an example. You might get a new message to appear at any time, so you'll check occasionally. Okay? All right. How do we apply operant conditioning or different applications? Although operant conditioning came through theoretical interest, it's kind of have a long history of application on how we use it. Two examples can be this: persuasion and applied behavioral analysis on modification or behavior and modification. And if y'all are real interested in learning, then Dr. Hudson do teach behavior modification, and guess what he's using, everybody? Learning. So now you have an idea of what that psych elective may be. It'd be interesting to discover and find out just how it goes in a deeper level. But when we're trying to persuade someone to do something, the most effective training technique is to start with easy behaviors, reinforce those behaviors, and then we'll gradually try to shape more complex behaviors. Remember, shaping, okay? When we're talking about applied behavior analysis, it's also considered to be behavior modification. So a psychologist will remove reinforcement for unwanted behaviors and provide reinforcement for those behaviors that they're looking for. So school psychologists, they might institute programs that'll help encourage children with attention deficit disorder or even to be able to complete more school assignments. Additionally, we like to be able to utilize verbal praise. So children might receive points for each assignment completed, as well as additional points for completing it accurately. We call that a token system. That they'll lose points for any kind of rule violation. So, or being out of the seat, for example. So at the end of the week, those numbers will then be or points they'll accumulate. It might go to a party, it might go to a field trip, or they might get a medal. Each teacher might utilize something different, but the result is that the program has a significant increase in completion of assignments as well as better class behaviors. I'm going to end here for today, and we'll pick up again in the next video. So thank you for listening, and peace.